Welcome to Vision India at 75 Vision India Forum's initiative to celebrate Amrit Mahotsav. Shri Naresh Gujralji, MP, Member of Parliament, Honorable Member of Parliament of the Rajya Sabha, and the son of great leader Shri I.K. Gujralji, former Prime Minister of India. Great legacy. 75 years of India's glorious history, post-independence, cannot be discussed without the contributions of leaders like Shri I.K. Gujral, the former Prime Minister, no lesser than the great I.K. Gujral and his son. We have with us today to capture the life and times of Shri I.K. Gujral from the lens of the closest person possible. Nareshji himself is a very acclaimed politician, being the leader of Rajya Sabha. I don't know whether he's a leader, but he is definitely a member of the Rajya Sabha. And his father too was a Rajya Sabha member when he became the Prime Minister of India. And Nareshji, this is to celebrate 75 years of important events, history and leaders, current, past and future. Topics varied, subjects varied are being covered. Today we'll talk about the sub-series of the Prime Ministers, wherein your illustrious great former Prime Minister father Shri I.K. Gujral's times and life shall be discussed from your eyes. As a father, as a human being, as a gentleman, as a political leader, and as the Prime Minister of India. Times and life of Shri I.K. Gujral. Over to you, Shri Naresh Gujral.
Thank you very much. Quite frankly, Gonkaji, I don't know what is the format. If you'd like me to speak on my father for a short while and then ask questions, we can do that. So I'll give you a brief introduction on his early life. Mr. Gujral was born in Jhelum, now in Pakistan, in 1919 to freedom fighters Shri A.N. Gujral and Shrimati Pushpa Gujral. Both his father was a leading lawyer of Jhelum, but when Gandhi made the call to fight for the freedom of this country, he joined the Gandhian movement and then courted arrest many times. His wife, Shrimati Pushpa Gujral, also followed suit and was in jail a couple of times. In fact, there was a time when the entire family was in jail. My grandfather, my grandfather, my father, Shri I.K. Gujral, who was only 21, and because his two sisters were very young, they were with my grandmother and they were also in jail, leaving behind only one young son who was deaf, Shri Satish Gujral, who later became an internationally acclaimed artist and architect. So that was the kind of household that he grew up in. At 11, he was badly beaten up by the British police for leading a procession of students asking for independence of India. He was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Students' Union and the Communist Party of then Punjab, but students' wing, of course. He was very active in politics in those days, in the students' movement. After the partition of India, incidentally, I must mention that his father, Shri A.N. Gujral, was a member of the Pakistan Constituent Assembly, and he took oath as a member on the 14th of August in Pakistan, along with Shri Jinnah. Unfortunately, thereafter, we all know how the riots broke out both sides of the border. And that is when the family had to leave Pakistan and literally come to India as refugees. My father often narrated that how when his family or my family, when the ladies arrived in Delhi by train from Mumbai, they had to sleep the night on the railway platform because there was curfew outside and firing was going on outside the old Delhi railway station. He rebuilt his life from there. Very soon, he fought an election from Delhi, what was then known as the Electoral College. That you would recall, there was no assembly in Delhi at that time. There was only municipal corporation. So to elect members to the Rajya Sabha, you needed electoral college. So there were members of the corporation who would vote, and from New Delhi, electoral college members had to vote. He fought the elections twice. First time he was elected unopposed, and the second time he fought against the then Jansang's president, who forfeited his deposit against him. That is when he came to the attention of Pandit Nehru, and he was appointed vice president of New Delhi Municipal Committee. He had a long innings here, and in 1964, he was elected to the Rajya Sabha. Thereafter, in 1966, he became a minister in Mrs. Gandhi's cabinet. He remained in Mrs. Gandhi's cabinet till the date of the emergency. Everybody knows very well his encounter with Mr. Sanjay Gandhi the day emergency was declared, when he refused to share the news bulletins with Mr. Sanjay Gandhi and said that bulletins would only be sent to the Prime Minister's office and not to Mr. Gandhi. He had a brush with him, and soon he was removed from, the same day he was removed from that ministry and moved to the Department of Planning, which was basically, he was banished from that ministry. Since he had close relationship with Mrs. Indira Gandhi, she decided to utilize his services. She knew his strength, and she sent him as ambassador to Moscow the following year. He remained as ambassador in Moscow for 5 years. And those, if you remember, were very hard times for India. Our dependence on Russia was a lot, whether it was defense supplies, whether it was oil, whether it was fertilizer, and various other things. And we had a very thriving rupee-ruble trade at that time. And he contributed a lot to increasing that and to ensure that relations between the two countries remained very strong and positive, despite the change in government in New Delhi. Mr. Morarji Desai became the Prime Minister, but he requested Mr. Gujral at that stage tendered his resignation. But Morarji Bhai said, "You must stay on. You're doing very good service for the nation." So he was asked to stay back. Mrs. Gandhi then again came back to power in 1980 and asked him to remain there for another year. He finally came back to India sometimes in 1980, towards the end of 1980. But he was disillusioned with the Congress party and the way the emergency had been declared in India. In 1989, he fought elections from Jalandhar to the Lok Sabha. He was elected with a large majority and then became foreign minister in Mr. VP Singh's cabinet. Thereafter, when the VP Singh government fell, Mr. Chandrasekhar asked him to join his cabinet, which he politely turned down. He then again then he was re-elected to Rajya Sabha once again, and he became foreign minister in Mr. Deva Gowda's cabinet in 1996, and in 1997 he became Prime Minister of India. In 98 he fought again the elections to the Lok Sabha and again won with a thumping majority that election. But by then Mr. Vajpayee had taken over as Prime Minister. He stayed on as a member of Parliament for a year, and again when elections were declared, he was offered a seat, but he said, "No, I would rather retire gracefully. I've had my innings," and he decided to quit politics. He wrote his memoirs after that, which are in the public domain. The basic thing was he remains popular till today. He is known as a gentleman prime minister. But I think that is primarily because of the fact that he remained simple, accessible, and a man without airs for all these years. And that, I think, was the reason of his success and his popularity. You know very well, through his career, not one allegation was ever made against him for corruption or any kind of misdemeanor. And I think that's a rich legacy that he has left us, which we all cherish. He was deeply interested in Urdu poetry. Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Kafi Azmi, Ali Sadar Jafri, they were his close friends. In fact, Faiz Ahmed Faiz was his English teacher, and there was an age gap. Yet they remained very good friends because of their love for Urdu poetry. He was also involved with theatre. Few people know that he was the founding president of Delhi Arts Theatre, which produced the famous Heer Ranjha in those days under Sheila Bhatia. He was a collector of art. He had a large collection. His younger brother Satish Gujral was a very well-known artist, and he was also interested in music. Mr. Gujral was widely traveled, and I don't think there was any country in the world which he had not visited, either in office or when he was not in office. He would travel extensively. People remember him now for the famous Gujral doctrine, which was to have very close relations with the neighbors. And you would recall that during his prime ministership, India had the best of relations with every single neighbor, including Pakistan. Nawaz Sharif always looked up to him, had maintained very good relations with him, even after Mr. Gujral demitted office. He was committed to secularism, and he believed that if this country has to remain united, it must be, the prime ministers must be compassionate, prime ministers must be secular, and prime minister must deal an even hand to every community. And that is why I think whether it was the Sikhs or the Muslims or the other minorities, Christians, Jains, they all looked up to him, whether he was in office or out of office. Anything else that you would like to ask, I'd be very happy to answer.
Firstly, what was your experience like with him growing up as a child and as a son?
Well, what one learned from him was whoever came to his doorstep, whether he knew him or not, if somebody came to ask for help, Mr. Gujral was readily available. He would go out of his way to help. And he would always tell us that if God puts you in a situation when you can help people and you do not make the time to help, then you will be punished. You must help if you are in public life and if you are in a position to help. In fact, he would say to my wife that even if you are not in public life, when God deals you a hand that you can help people, then you must go out of your way to help. Make the time, find the time, but go out of your way to help. And I think that was his basic personality, which he imbibed perhaps from his parents, where they came from, as I said, my grandfather was in public life, my grandmother was in public life. And when you have struggled for the independence of this nation from a very early age, these are values that you imbibe. And that is what we learned from him. Number two, irrespective of the temptation, don't fall for a temptation. Remain upright, remain honest, and serve the country. And I think that was another lesson he taught us very quietly, but by example. Third, his emphasis always was on education. He made sure that whether it was me, who he insisted that I become a chartered accountant, so I will be able to stand on my feet. He insisted that my younger brother study. He did his MBA. Then he went to America on a scholarship. So he always said education is the backbone of any society, and you must make sure that you use your best potential, and you will only realize your best potential if you are properly educated. So another thing I must say, he was devoted to educating a girl child, whether it was as prime minister or earlier as a minister. That was like a mission for him. And he would say, when you educate a girl, you've educated a family. When you educate a boy, you've educated one person. Also, I should mention here that after partition, my grandparents, my grandfather especially, was asked by Mr. Nehru to stay back in Pakistan to pull out Hindus who were stuck in villages which were dominated, of course, by the Muslims. My grandfather stayed back for 6 months. He was provided a little bit of army support, and he pulled out thousands of people and brought them across the border. Finally, when he moved back to India after 7 months, there were 2 or 3 girls whose parents could not be traced. And in one case, because the young girl had been molested by the people that side, the parents refused to take her. That is when they decided to set up a home for the destitute women in Jalandhar, which under the name of Nari Niketan, which is very famous today in Punjab. And thereafter, this idea came to my grandmother that the best way would be for the destitute women to look after orphan children. And I'm very proud to say that after them, my father ran that institute. Now I run that institute. We have been responsible for the adoption of over 1,200 children who have gone to very good homes. These are little orphans who come to us. We've also had hundreds of girls who, at that time, you would recall, very few people would adopt girls soon after partition, and I would say almost up to 1990 or so. So we would educate them. Eventually, we would give them some vocational training and marry them. So we've settled hundreds of such girls. And today in Jalandhar, we are running this institution, which is not only, we have about 50 orphans living there under very good conditions, but we also have a school for the poor, which educates about 700 children. At the same time, we have within the same institution, we are providing vocational training to young girls so that they can stand on their feet. Because these were the ideals which were very dear to my father's heart. And we do this in his memory and the memory of my grandparents.
He closely worked with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru ji. He worked very closely with Srimati Indira Gandhi ji and then with VP Singh ji. He denied joining the cabinet of Prime Minister Chandrasekhar, and then he himself took over post Mr. Deve Gowda's stint as the Prime Minister. What do you remember his experiences like with the former Prime Ministers, and what was the major reasons for him to have disconnects with Mr. Sanjay Gandhi and then not joining Chandrasekhar's cabinet?
Well, he was very close to Mrs. Indira Gandhi. As I said, he was in her first cabinet. They were more like friends. I remember Mrs. Gandhi coming to our home all the time when she was only Minister for Information Broadcasting after Panditji's passing away. They had a very good rapport. The problem was when Sanjay Gandhi started behaving, first of all, he was very upset when emergency was declared, press censorship was imposed, and the leaders were arrested. And he did not want to be party to press censorship. So he made it very clear to Mrs. Gandhi, and that is why he was removed as Minister for Information and Broadcasting. With Sanjay Gandhi, the problem was one of style. Sanjay was behaved in an arrogant manner, which my father was not willing to accept. He told him in no uncertain terms that you are the same age as my son, and if you wish to speak to me, you will speak to me with respect and not the way you are used to dealing with others. But then at that time, we all know how much influence he commanded. So he ensured that his mother removed my father from that ministry the same day. But frankly, my father was very relieved because he said he was not cut out for imposing press censorship and such things. Thereafter, as I said, he went as ambassador. When he came back, he was instrumental in kind of creating opposition unity. I remember the first leaders meeting of all opposition parties was held in his house in Maharani Bagh, where from N.T. Rama Rao, Jyoti Basu, Mr. Hegde, Farooq Abdullah, Karunanidhi, everybody, almost all political parties were present. Mr. Biju Patnaik, I can't remember all the names now, but all the leaders then came there. And that is how opposition unity was talked of. Thereafter, we all know what happened, the unfortunate assassination of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Then Rajiv Gandhi won with a very decisive mandate. And when Rajiv Gandhi finally finished his term and elections were called, that is when, if you would recall, Janata Dal was formed. And my father was invited.
Did he hold any position in Rajiv Gandhi's time? I don't remember, sir.
No. In Rajiv Gandhi's time, he was out of politics. In the sense, he was not holding any position.
Then the reasons, because Rajiv ji was supposed to be quite opposite in nature to Mr. Sanjay Gandhi.
While my father had very good relations with Rajiv Gandhi, I think the main problem was that he was very upset with Rajiv Gandhi for not taking immediate steps to quell the massacre of the Sikhs in Delhi. That is when my father criticized Rajiv Gandhi. That is when he decided to hold the hands of the Sikhs. If you remember, the Sikhs were completely sidelined, the Sikhs were pushed to the wall, and nobody was willing to speak for this community. This brave community, which has made so much sacrifices for this country, felt totally isolated. That is when my father decided to form what was then known as the Punjab Group, with Mr. Kuldeep Nair, with Air Marshal Arjun Singh. They made a Punjab Group and started a dialogue between the government, and the Sikhs, which eventually led to the Longowal Accord. He was very close to Mr. Longowal, and he persuaded Mr. Longowal to come to Delhi and resolve issues with the government of Rajiv Gandhi. So he never joined the government, but he played a pivotal role at that time in ensuring.
Being such an influential leader in the central government for such a long time, and having worked with Indira Gandhi so closely, and then what happened in '84, post that he was known to have supported the Sikh community's cause and not joined Rajiv ji's cabinet, though he would have easily have held the positions, whatever he wanted, and with a prime minister who was loved by most. Yes, the Sikh issue was flaming by and large by that time, and Mr. Gujral had gone back to Punjab, as you rightly yourself pointed out. So what was his role in tackling the Punjab terror, the Bhindranwalas and the Harmandir Sahib issues and all these things? What role did he play vis-a-vis the center and the factions? What role did he play?
You see, two things that happened. Akali Dal had splintered. There were various factions there. There was a Longowal faction, and then there were many other factions. The militants were there, which were the hardliners. And then, of course, there was the Badal group, there was the Toda group. So he first played a role to unite them, to say that you Sikhs' voice will be heard when you talk in one voice. If you are going to be divided, nobody is going to negotiate with you. That was one role that they played in uniting them, in removing the misunderstandings that these leaders had in their own minds about each other. It was not an easy task, I must tell you. It was a long months were spent in allaying these, I would say, doubts about each other amongst the leadership. And then talking to the leadership in Delhi to say, you cannot completely write off such an important minority community which has made so much sacrifice for this nation. And a community which is brave. And if you continue to behave like that, this will lead to the consequences would be very grave for this country. And I must say, even in Delhi, Rajiv Gandhi saw a point in what this group was trying to tell him. There were many parleys between them. And then a kind of an agreed formula was evolved, which eventually came to be known as the Longowal Accord. It's very unfortunate that soon after that, Mr. Longowal was assassinated. And also, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's government went back on commitments which were made in that accord, including giving Chandigarh to Punjab as the capital. But that is history. The good thing was the Sikhs came back into the mainstream, and thereafter Mr. Rajiv Gandhi lost elections. My father, I still remember, one day after Mr. VP Singh was sworn in, he took him to the Golden Temple. The senior members of the cabinet accompanied Mr. VP Singh. And the whole idea was it was a gesture to a hand of friendship towards the Sikhs and Punjab, that as of now, you can trust the government in Delhi. So that trust deficit which was there, that was restored thanks to his efforts.
We talk about the role that I.K. Gujralji had with the Janata Dal. And with the Janata Dal, especially starting with, say, for example, with Mr. VP Singh's time. Mr. VP Singh's time, there were many issues which had the country on the boil. Mandal Commission was one of them. His view on that?
My father, I remember this very vividly. My father was, when Mandal, Mr. VP Singh declared that he was accepting the Mandal Commission report, and the problem that just begun in Delhi. My father was in New York attending the UN on India's behalf, and he called Mr. VP Singh and said, this will lead to huge problems both in the country and for you. And I would still urge you to find a way and not implement it straight away like this. Build a consensus, take all the parties along, let it be debated. He was not against the Mandal Commission, but he said you cannot just foist it overnight. You have to carry everybody together. You have to carry all communities together. So find a way not to do it like this in one, fell swoop. You take time over it, build a national consensus, and then introduce it. But then, of course, it was too late by then when Mr. VP Singh was too committed and did not take his advice.
Mr. Gujral had been through the worst of times during the freedom movement, right from the age of 10, 11, as you educated us today. He has seen the India's growth story right from the time of independence so closely up to, say, the Indira Gandhi issue and the Punjab terror. The same time Kashmir was simmering, an issue which was boiling over the last 50 years, 45 years, really catapulted into its zenith. And 1990 was a time when VP Singh and Mufti Muhammad Saeed when he was there. Mr. Gujral was also part of the ministry as far as I remember. If I'm wrong, please correct me, sir, because there are so many things, So, but Mr. Gujral stand on the Kashmir issue because it was not something which happened overnight. The Kashmiri Pandits.
Mr. Gujral believed that what was happening in Kashmir was really a proxy war. He could see very clearly the hand of Pakistan in it. The so-called terrorists were in fact trained by Pakistan, financed by Pakistan, provided arms and ammunition by Pakistan. So this had been festering for a while. Yes, the kidnapping of the then Home Minister's daughter in a way brought it to the fore. But the fact is that this had been festering for a while, and Pakistan was always financing the terrorists there. But yes, Mr. Gujral believed that the one mistake that was made by the government of India, by Rajiv Gandhi's government, and by Mr. Farooq Abdullah, who incidentally happened to be a great friend of my father's, and he continues to be my friend. My father's feeling was that they should have taken steps. There was a general impression, I'll give you a background, there was a general impression that when Farooq Abdullah got together with Rajiv Gandhi, that election was rigged. And that was the last straw that broke the camel's back. That when people in Kashmir started believing that it was a rigged election, they felt that their right was taken away, the democracy had been denied to them. And that is when the problems really increased manifold. He told this in my presence to Mr. Farooq Abdullah. I still remember we were in Kashmir. We went to have coffee with Mr. Farooq Abdullah, and my father told him that what was the need to rig the election. And Farooq Saab, of course, denied it. But he felt that that was a major blunder that was made both by Mr. Rajiv Gandhi and Mr. Abdullah. Now, I do not know what the facts are. Nobody knows what the facts are. But there was a general belief in Kashmir that, and when Mr. Abdullah denied that the elections had been rigged, my father said that it's all the more sad that people believe that elections have been rigged. And here I must take you back a little bit. My father was extremely friendly with Farooq Saab's father, Sheikh Abdullah. When Sheikh Abdullah was on his deathbed, I still remember my father got a message that please come to Srinagar. And we all went to Srinagar. Sheikh Saab put us up in his official residence, and doctors had forbidden Sheikh Abdullah to not speak for more than 10-15 minutes because his lungs were badly affected. So he would send for my father in the evening, and my father would say some things, Farooq Saab, Sheikh Saab would reply, but these meetings would be only 20 minutes to half an hour because the doctor would be sitting there, and as soon as the doctor felt that Sheikh Saab was getting exhausted, the meeting would be put to an end. One of the things that Sheikh Saab said, he said, "You are my friend, and I'm telling you one thing, and I've told Farooq also, that never touch the hand of Congress. The day you touch the hand of Congress in Delhi, people in India, the people in Kashmir will literally spit on my grave. My son may try to make this mistake, but if he tries to make that mistake, I'm giving this responsibility to you to ensure that he doesn't do so. Do remind him of what my wishes are." History, unfortunately, turned out to be different. Farooq Saab did form that coalition government with Congress, and I think things deteriorated rapidly thereafter.
Yeah, I think that we can only, in hindsight, think of considering what you're just telling us. And this pretty much common sense with whatever we know, little bit know about Mr. Gujral. In hindsight, we can only hope he had more power. Probably he had stayed back as a prime minister for a longer time, and probably at an earlier time. That is the only thing we can
Here
hope.
also, I must tell you something very interesting. When Congress was going to withdraw support from Mr. Gujral, and you would recall, an allegation was made that DMK was responsible for the death of Mr. Rajiv Gandhi. And a demand was made that Mr. Gujral should drop the DMK ministers in his cabinet and he can continue. My father refused point blank. He said there is no evidence at all. DMK is not just a political party, but a political movement also. The moment I do that, I will be alienating the population of Tamil Nadu. And as Prime Minister, it is my duty to ensure that the whole country stays united. I would rather quit. I would rather not stay as Prime Minister, but I will not compromise. So he refused to compromise and Congress party withdrew support. Thereafter, you know very well that DMK was part of Dr. Manmohan Singh's government for 10 years. But my father at that time, he said, I will not compromise and I will not accept any conditions.
What was his role with respect to the fodder scam? And because I think during his prime ministership only this thing came to the limelight, the fodder scam, Lalu Yadav.
Well, he had no role there in the sense there was a fodder scam in Bihar. It was a state subject. When Mr. Lalu Prasad was finally convicted, my father told him, you have just a couple of hours to resign. If you don't resign, we will be forced to dismiss you. Within the next half an hour, you know, Mrs. Ravri Devi was elected as the leader of the party there, and she was appointed as the chief minister. And then the rest is history. Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav went to jail, and he's been in and out of jail ever since.
Uttar Pradesh emergency?
Sorry?
Uttar Pradesh president's rule?
Uttar Pradesh president's rule again is a very interesting story. There was a lot of pressure on him to declare president's rule there, which he refused to concede to. Thereafter, I still remember a long, very, very long cabinet meeting took place, which lasted almost 12 hours, which is never unprecedented, because he felt that his cabinet had so many regional parties that every regional party must be allowed to express its view. And that eventually, of course, we will go with majority. My father's own view was that there is no constitutional validity for asking for president's rule there. But everybody, including the left, Mulayam Singh Yadav, all other parties were putting a lot of pressure on him to declare president's rule. At which point, I still remember, Mr. Narayanan, who was president, was a friend of my father's, and he spoke to Mr. Narayanan and told him that I will now have to fire from your shoulder. We will ask you, and you send us a letter of caution, and that is exactly what happened. That the cabinet asked the president sent a letter of caution, and then my father told the cabinet that there you are. I was warning you that this will not go through. Here is a letter of caution. Of course, we can overrule the letter of caution from the president, but that would be playing with fire. By then, regional leaders like Mr. Chandrababu Naidu and Mr. Jyoti Basu were brought back on board, and then they agreed not to declare president's rule.
How would Mr. Gujral have handled the farmers' agitation?
I think, as I said to you earlier, he believed that you have to have consensus in everything. You have to carry people with you. You do not foist anything overnight. And that is exactly the advice he gave to Mr. VP Singh also, on the Mandal issue. So I think what he probably would have done was, and I'm saying openly that it was not that the three laws which the Prime Minister was trying to bring were bad in law, or that they were not reformative in nature, but people were not consulted. It was foisted on them. There was no, I would say, even with the farmers associations, unions and all, there was no dialogue. My father was a great believer in dialogue. So he would have had a long dialogue, built a consensus, taken all the political parties along, and only then enacted something like this. And now that you have mentioned this, I said it in Parliament, my party said it in Parliament. I kept beseeching the BJP that please send it to a select committee so that we can hear all the voices before enacting it into law. Again, the rest is history, but that's the way he would have handled it.
Just as history, but the history has paved the way for the future, and it is probably a different way in which history is unfolding itself. Herein we have the Aam Aadmi Party now taking over Punjab. Future for Punjab from here now?
Well, look, people of Punjab have voted in favor of Aam Aadmi Party. We must give them a full chance. That is what democracy is all about. But I do feel that the commitments and the promises which have been made by the Aam Aadmi Party, they will never be able to fulfill, because Punjab is bankrupt. We are short of power as it is. So promising freebies is very easy to win elections, but it's very difficult, a very difficult task. And I don't think whether it's our government there or Mr. Kejriwal's council in Delhi, that they can do anything to address that issue. Delhi was a different situation. They inherited a surplus budget from Sheila Dikshit. Delhi is a consuming society. Delhi gives you huge amount of taxation. There is a huge growth of revenue each year, which is not the case in Punjab. It's an agrarian society. Industry has not even touched Punjab. So I think they have a huge challenge on their hands, but I do hope they can succeed, because if they don't succeed, I see bad days ahead in my state, which I love so much.
Probably, because this show is not today's show, our discussion is not about Punjab, it is only about Shri Gujral. I would limit my discussion on this issue by only saying that probably the nadir with respect to many social issues had been reached. Economy is probably a different thing altogether, but social issues also, the nadir had been reached from a lot of perspectives in Punjab. The people probably believe that the only way is way upwards from here, and they just needed a little bit of an inflection point. Probably Aam Aadmi Party was the inflection point that they were waiting for. Today they are looking forward to a better Punjab. But we hope that had Mr. Gujral, we can only hope in hindsight, as I had mentioned earlier, had Mr. Gujral, with his unblemished track record as a human being, as a heart of gold, a man who was educated, who believed in education, a man who was not having anything to do with any dynasty or with any kind of, capital houses, a man who had an unblemished track record as far as my knowledge goes. Had he stayed back longer, but then in India, to take and carry forward and carry along a coalition of so many leaders, so many regional parties, has always been a task which is unenviable. Today, the only difference is we have a party which has got a majority in this center. Had Mr. Gujral been fortunate to have such kind of, fortunes during his time and political times, India would have been served by a much, much wonderful human being. India would have been well served. And today we would have been in a much better position than what we were. Probably Narasimha Rao, who made the economic reforms, we would have been talking about some big reforms that might have been brought by Mr. Gujral as well. Thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure, Mr. Naresh Gujral, the son of the great leader, Shri I.K. Gujral, and himself a great leader, Rajya Sabha MP. Jai Hind, look forward again, sir. Namaskar.
Thank you very much.